August 13th, 1944. A Polish village frozen in an eerie, unnatural silence. In the middle of an empty street, Soviet scouts stumble upon a 69-ton steel Titan. No shots fired, no engine roar, only the dead silence of a hollowed-out monster. When the Red Army soldiers finally dare to climb inside, they are stunned. The fuel tanks are topped off, the ammunition racks are gleaming with shells, and every mechanism is in perfect working order. The crew of the Third Reich's newest secret weapon simply abandoned it and ran. Only hours earlier, this King Tiger was the undisputed master of the battlefield, the tank Hitler called his last hope. Germany poured colossal resources into this iron giant at the height of the war. So why did elite German tankers choose a shameful flight over a fight in the most powerful tank of World War II? What turned Nazi Germany's technical triumph into a useless toy, left to rot in the middle of a road? The story of this steel colossus began in August 1942. While German forces were clawing toward the Volga and the Caucasus, Berlin was obsessed with a strange objective. Why did the Reich need a new heavy tank when they already had the formidable Tiger and the Panther was entering production? The answer wasn't in the armor, but in a single gun. The weaponry department issued an order to build a platform for the new 88mm cannon with a 71 caliber barrel. This monstrous weapon could punch through any armor at distances the enemy couldn't even dream of reaching. The Wehrmacht High Command envisioned a sniper tank capable of picking off enemy machines long before they could even get a lock. It was a unique moment in tank history. Usually, you design the vehicle and then find a gun to fit. Here, they flipped it. The gun came first, and the tank was merely a carriage for this giant barrel. This fatal decision laid the foundation for nearly every failure the King Tiger would face. Two bitter rivals locked horns for the right to build this new predator. On one side was the legendary Ferdinand Porsche, a personal friend of the Führer, who approached the project with the flair of a maverick genius. He proposed 5 different variants featuring complex electric transmissions and exotic suspensions. However, his designs terrified the military with their astronomical costs and the sheer amount of scarce copper required for production. A completely different strategy was chosen by Erwin Aders, the chief engineer at Henschel, known as the father of Tigers. He rejected risky experiments, betting on maximum unification with the existing Panther and battle-proven components. Aders used sloped armor and the 700-horsepower Maybach engine already in production. The deciding factor in this duel was the chassis with its overlapping road wheels. This specific layout was designed by Dr. Knipkamp, the very official responsible for ordering the new tank. Using the customer's own invention secured Henschel the military's unconditional favor. Ferdinand Porsche was so blinded by his proximity to the Führer and his belief in his own technical superiority that he made a fatal gamble. Without waiting for the official results or the Ministry of Armaments's decision, he personally ordered Krupp to begin production on 50 turrets for his design. It was an act of unheard-of arrogance, putting a critical tank component into serial production before the vehicle had even been accepted. When the military finally rejected Porsche's temperamental and expensive chassis in favor of Henschel's project, it created an absurd crisis. The Wehrmacht was left with 50 complex, finished turrets and no hulls to put them on. In a world of total resource scarcity, melting them down was out of the question. Ultimately, German command was forced into a compromise later known as the Porsche-type turret. The first 50 production King Tigers were fitted with these sleek, elegant heads, which would prove in their very first engagement to be lethal death traps for their own crews. One genius's overconfidence had turned the Reich's newest tanks into hostages of a rushed design. The Porsche turret's elegant curve, so prized by aestheticians, proved to be a death warrant for the driver and radio operator. The rounded lower section of the frontal plate acted as a lethal springboard. When a shell struck this zone, it didn't ricochet away. Instead, it was deflected directly downward into the thin hull roof. Where the armor was only 40 millimeters thick, the shell sliced through like a hot knife through butter, instantly obliterating the controls and the crew. German tankers terrifiedly dubbed it the shot trap. Furthermore, the turret's complex shape was a manufacturing nightmare, and its electric drive frequently failed at the worst possible moments. Realizing a tank with such an Achilles heel couldn't survive for long, Henschel engineers rushed to develop a second version, the production turret, featuring a flat 180mm frontal face. It was simpler, more reliable, and finally eliminated the fatal ricochet, But the first 50 crews had already rolled into battle in machines that actively guided enemy fire into their own most vulnerable spots. Hitler's grand vision of a steel monster tidal wave crashed into the harsh reality of total war. The Reich aimed to churn out 120 King Tigers a month, hoping to flood the front lines with invincible armor. But Allied bombers had other plans. In the fall of 1944, the skies over Kassel, home to the Henschel factories, turned into a literal hell. 569 heavy bombers rained thousands of tons of high explosives onto the assembly lines. The resulting firestorm raged for 7 days, gutting nearly all production capacity. The result was catastrophic. Instead of hundreds of units, the plant could only squeeze out a few dozen per month. Of the planned 1,500 tanks, Germany managed to assemble fewer than 500. Every lost machine became irreplaceable, and the ambitious rearmament program devolved into an agony under a relentless hail of American and British bombs. Germany's industrial spine was snapped in the clouds over Kassel. By 1944, the German war machine faced a silent but deadly enemy, a shortage of alloying metals. Panic gripped the Reich's metallurgical labs as molybdenum stocks evaporated, tungsten supplies were severed, and manganese became as precious as gold. This struck a crushing blow to the King Tiger's armor quality. The steel became brittle. On the outside, the plates still looked imposing, but their internal structure now resembled over-tempered glass. A terrifying phenomenon emerged, which German tankers called internal spalling. Upon the impact of a large-caliber shell, the armor might not be breached, but hundreds of red-hot, razor-sharp shards would shatter off its inner face. They zipped through the fighting compartment at bullet speeds, shredding the crew and detonating ammunition racks. The fortress tank, designed to protect, had become a steel coffin that killed its own soldiers with its own armor. The King Tiger was losing its legendary invincibility at the smelting stage. By late '44, the Third Reich's cost-cutting measures bordered on the absurd. First, Zimmerit, the famous anti-magnetic coating, vanished from the hulls because the days required for its application and drying were deemed too precious. Command decided the risk of magnetic infantry mines was lower than the risk of missing a deployment deadline. But the desperation went further. To save time and paint, factories stopped priming and painting the interior surfaces of the fighting compartment. Crews received machines with bare, clanging metal inside. This not only accelerated corrosion but took a psychological toll on the soldiers, a constant reminder that they were trapped in a hastily assembled makeshift construct. The King Tiger, once the pride of a nation, had become a product of frantic haste, where basic quality and the comfort of the men heading into their final battle were sacrificed for a few extra hours on the assembly line. 69 tons of steel became not just a shield for Hitler, but an unbearable burden. The weight of the King Tiger turned into its ultimate curse, paralyzing the mobility of the entire army. Most European bridges of the era were rated for a maximum of 30 tons. Any attempt to move this monster across them ended in structural collapse. Commanders were forced to take detours of dozens of kilometers to find a suitable crossing, losing precious hours. The tank was far too heavy for soft ground. In the spring thaw or the marshy terrain of Poland, these giants simply sank up to their fenders. Recovering a bogged-down machine was nearly impossible. Towing a single disabled or stuck King Tiger required 3 heavy tractors simultaneously, which then became easy targets themselves. In the end, hundreds of functional, fully armed machines were blown up by their own crews during retreats simply because a small river or a patch of deep mud stood in their path. German engineering created a tank that was too heavy for the very earth it was meant to conquer. Every deployment of a King Tiger turned into an exhausting engineering quest. Due to its immense width, the tank exceeded standard railway clearances, forcing the crew into a humiliating and backbreaking procedure for every transport. The wide combat tracks and outer road wheels had to be stripped and replaced with narrow transport tracks. After offloading, the entire process was repeated in reverse. Tons of frozen or mud-caked iron had to be reassembled by hand. Even on the march, the suspension remained a catastrophe. The incredible weight meant that drive sprocket teeth were chewed through in just 250 kilometers, and the overloaded transmissions literally burned out. Instead of striking terror into the enemy, the crews of the Reich's finest tanks spent most of their time with sledgehammers and jacks in hand, trying to resuscitate a frozen steel carcass. The King Tiger was formidable in a gun sight, but on the move, it was the primary enemy of its own mechanics. The King Tiger's baptism of fire on the Western Front in Normandy delivered a shock to the Allies that quickly turned into fury. In July 1944, tanks of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion clashed with British Shermans. The difference in class was staggering. German guns punched straight through Allied machines from 2 kilometers away, while return fire simply ricocheted harmlessly off the giant's frontal armor. It was a triumph, but it was short-lived. As soon as the clouds cleared, the hammer from the sky, Allied air superiority, went to work. During Operation Goodwood, thousands of bombs rained down on German positions. Giant machines that couldn't be pierced by a cannon were flipped upside down by blast waves, burying their crews alive in massive craters. The Tiger's grandeur evaporated under the aerial onslaught, proving that in modern warfare, even the mightiest tank is easy prey for those who own the sky. The true collapse of the myth of invincibility occurred on the Eastern Front, in the dust of the Sandomier's bridgehead. German command banked on a sudden counterstrike by the newest King Tigers to drive Soviet forces back into the Vistula. Instead of a triumphal march, the battalions blundered into a masterfully set trap. Soviet tankers in T-34-85s and heavy IS-2s refused to engage in long-range duels where the German gun was omnipotent. They allowed the steel giants to close within a few hundred meters before opening fire from ambushes into their flanks. In this close-quarters brawl, a terrifying reality emerged. The lumbering Tigers simply couldn't rotate their turrets fast enough, and their brittle armor cracked under the impact of heavy calibers. In 3 days of fighting, the Wehrmacht lost dozens of irreplaceable machines, many abandoned by their crews in a panic. Sandomier's proved to the world the King Tiger was not an immortal god of war, but merely a very large and very vulnerable target for those who fought with skill rather than just numbers. By the end of the war, the aura of technical superiority had been replaced by primal fear. For German crews, the King Tiger became a psychological trap. On one hand, the thick armor offered an illusion of safety. On the other, every soldier knew that if this lumbering giant stalled or threw a track, it became a steel coffin with no exit. The massive hatches were nearly impossible to open under fire, and the cramped interior meant any ammunition cook-off resulted in an instantaneous hell. Crews began to suffer from a reverse form of tiger phobia, a paralyzing dread of being immobilized. This is why official reports increasingly listed machines abandoned due to minor malfunction or blown up by crew under threat of encirclement. The soldiers of the Reich no longer believed in their wonder weapon. They realized that victory belonged to speed and reliability, 2 things their monster utterly lacked. The morale of the Panzerwaffe was shattering as fast as the over-tempered steel of their final tanks. The final agony of the King Tigers unfolded against the backdrop of a burning Europe in the spring of 1945. Hitler's last-ditch effort to turn the tide was the offensive at Lake Balaton in Hungary. There, in the viscous March mud, the Wehrmacht lost 19 of its finest machines in just 2 months, dying not only from Soviet shells, but from their own sheer clumsiness. The remaining giants crawled back toward Berlin and East Prussia. In Königsberg and on the approaches to the Reich Chancellery, they were no longer used as breakthrough tanks, but as stationary pillboxes. Buried to their turrets in the earth or hidden within the ruins of buildings, they remained lethal, racking up dozens of Soviet kills. But these were merely the death throes of a dying beast. By May 1945, everything was thrown into the meat grinder. Training models, test beds, and even that original abandoned Porsche prototype. The last King Tiger was knocked out on May 2nd near the Spandau Bridge in Berlin. Symbolically, the last of its kind fell alongside the final collapse of the Third Reich's insane ambitions. Today, one of those King Tigers captured in that Polish village sits motionless in Kubinka, outside Moscow. Looking at its colossal silhouette, it's easy to fall under the spell of German engineering genius. But history has passed a different judgment on this machine. A project meant to be a triumph of will and technology instead became a monument to organizational chaos and unchecked hubris. Hitler wanted an invincible sword, but he created only a clunky, brittle shield that cracked under the weight of Soviet tanks and Allied air power. The King Tiger remains a symbol of the Third Reich's death rattle, too heavy, too expensive, and far too late. The sniper tank, now Museum Exhibit number 502, stands as a permanent reminder that even the thickest armor is powerless when it stands for a lost war and the shattered illusions of world saltation. The hollow end of this steel giant was the inevitable finale of the Nazi Empire itself.